You're listening to the Wanderlusting Wives podcast, your podcast for escaping life's monotony, indulging in your wildest travel fantasies, and discovering the constant beauty of this ever-changing world.
On today's episode, Rachel Ingersoll joins us for part one of a two-part series on the who, what, when, where, and why of your Disney World vacation.
Welcome to the Wanderlusting Wives podcast. We are your navigators, Allison
And Regan, and welcome to another episode, a Travel Tuesday episode of the Wanderlusting Wives podcast. We are so excited. I'm just going to say that I'm a little biased about this episode because, as you know on this podcast, I am a huge Disney Parks fan, and we do have our guest today who is going to share so much new information about different experiences within the parks, different components that you might not know exist within the parks for Disney. So we're going to dive right into that. But before we introduce our guest, Allie, go ahead and plug our social media.
All right, I'll keep it short and sweet because we've got a lot of information we want to get through. So you can follow us on Instagram at Wanderlusting Wives, Twitter at Wanderlust Wives, Facebook Wanderlusting Wives Podcast. And if you're interested in reaching out to us, we have an email that is wanderlustingwives@gmail.com. And of course, we'd be happy to get any 5-star reviews you're willing to leave us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to your podcast. Sorry, I had to say that. Every podcaster says that, right? Anyways, check us out. Give us a 5-star review. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, so without further ado, another 5-star episode coming at you. Be sure to rate it. Our special guest today is Rachel Ingersoll, and funnily enough, I came across Rachel on Instagram just kind of by happenstance. Like, it was just like total chance. Allie and I were like, oh, we really want to look for a person who can come on and just give us their opinion and their thoughts and their expertise about what Disney looks like what visiting Disney looks like. And then I was looking on her page and I was like, yep, Rachel's perfect. Reached out. I'm so glad to have her. So Rachel, welcome to the Wanderlusting Wives podcast.
Thank you, Regan. Allie. So happy to be here and excited to talk all things Disney with y'all.
Yeah, we're super excited to have you here. But before we get into the Disney, we'll give you some time to shine. If you want to share a little bit about yourself, where we can find about more information with your travels, because I know you don't just go to Disney, you go all over the place. So the floor is yours.
Sure. So I'll give you a little bit of my background first, and then I'll plug the socials. So Rachel Ingersoll, I am 29, and I work as a public health and military researcher in my day hours. And on the side, I love photography and travel and anything that has to do with being active, movement, hiking, dancing, running, biking, swimming, kind of the whole gamut. And then I'm a little bit of an introvert, so I do love reading and going to the movies. And then I love everything Disney, Marvel, and Star Wars. So a little bit about me. You can find me on Instagram at @Ingersoll. Same on YouTube. TikTok, I'm the Ringersoll because our Ingersoll was already taken. And then Twitter and X, I am at Rach Ingersoll because all of the other ones were already taken as well.
Yeah, you gotta do what you gotta do. And sometimes you're like, wait, how is that already taken? Like, this exists somewhere else in the
universe?
Who are you?
Goes into deep dive as to who this human is.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thanks for sharing a little bit about yourself. It's really exciting, as we've already said, to have you. So let's just jump right in here. So I want to start here with like some general questions about your experience with the Disney parks. So can you tell us about like what Disney destinations you've been to and what a typical Disney vacation looks like for you? Like, who do you go with? Is there a specific time you like to go? All that kind of stuff.
Sure. So my main home park, I'm an annual pass holder at Walt Disney World in Florida. So that is like the main destination in which I am typically going to. I have also been to Disneyland once, which is fantastic. And then I've done 2 different Disney cruises in my time and haven't gotten to reach the international parks yet, but they're on my travel bucket list for future travel endeavors. So I'll talk about Walt Disney World first. Who I typically go with is typically either family or friends, and it just depends on the trip that I'm planning. I've recently done trips with both, and I'm actually going again next weekend with a friend as well for the preview of Tiana's Bayou Adventure, the new ride that's coming out, which is very exciting. So when I plan, I typically go around the top priorities of the group. So how many people am I going with? Are we making restaurant reservations? Are people like foodies? Is the goal to like try a bunch of restaurants and try a bunch of food? Is it to ride as many rides as humanly possible? Is it to see the new entertainment shows or the new fireworks or anything surrounding a performance? Those all take chunks of time in your Disney day, and knowing what people's like must do's or top priorities are really helpful. So for me, it's typically like, what are your must ride rides? What shows do you want to see? What to prioritize? So that sort of looks different in planning if you're going for a specific festival per se, or a specific time of year where you're celebrating a specific holiday or special events around a holiday. My favorite destination, I love Castaway Cay in the Bahamas. That is what Disney's private island, as you would say, on a Disney cruise. And that is just so magical because it's relaxing. You're on the beach, but it's also got flares of Disney sort of touches everywhere, and you can still meet and interact with characters. And there's also an adult only section separate from the kids section. So you can kind of tailor your trip to the people you're with. And then in the parks themselves, my favorite land per se is Galaxy's Edge in Batuu in Hollywood Studios. I am the biggest Star Wars fan, and what they did with Galaxy's Edge and Batuu is just creating like you are stepping into that world. You cross through that like bridge threshold into that land, and everything down to the minute detail is so organized in a way that you're entranced in that land. Even the trash cans, like everything is disguised in a way that you don't leave the land or the world that you're being put in. And that is one of the most up to date and neat details of any of the Disney parks that I've seen. And then over at Disneyland, Avengers Campus is, I spent so much time there, and that's in Disney's California Adventure, which is one of the two parks for Disneyland. And that it has a similar vibe. Everything is set up as if you're entering the world of the Avengers. So there's like a Spider-Man section, there's Avengers Tower, they have the Galaxy, just everything, the whole world is laid out in a way that you feel like you're stepping into that world. And it's really cool because they have characters walking around everywhere, and there aren't like designated meet and greet times for some of them. So you just stumble upon them walking around, and you can do photo ops, but you have like actual interactions with them, and like they'll walk you around the campus, and like sometimes you'll go on a spy hunt with them. It's just like the character interactions there are some of the best I've had in any of my experiences at Disney. And I just spent so much time in that land because of that, because just so many things are continuing to happen. And even just like sitting back and observing and watching things change. I love that. So those are some of my favorite things that I've gotten to experience.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I think Disney does the best is like that kind of creation of a world that makes you forget that another world exists. And for those of you who don't know, too, Disney has their own department that is in charge of this kind of thing, called their Imagineering department. And it's basically like the creative engineers behind the magic of the visual sets and the rides and all of these different things. They're the reason behind, I mean, there's a huge team behind every single thing they're doing, but they're the team behind the magic that you walk in and you're immersed in another world, and that's just so cool. And I did just want to go to this before we get too deep into the episode. I get asked a lot by people who maybe have never been to Disney or like have a certain view of Disney, like as an adult, like why would you go to Disney, or like how can you go so many times and it's just still fun? Like what would you say to somebody like that?
For me, I only got to go once as a child. We didn't have a whole lot of money growing up, so like having that one experience was so cool and so foundational, and it continued to tie my family together even as we got older. One of my fondest memories is going to the hair salon with my mom and my brother, and we would get our little kitty haircuts, and then while my mom had her hair dyed and cut and whatever that took 30 years. My brother and I would sit in front of the VHS, like old TV system that the hairdresser lady in my hometown had, and we would put in a Disney VHS. And a lot of the times it was Pocahontas, because that was one of like the three that she had in this. And so we would look at each other and be like, where did we leave off last time? And like do the little fast forward or rewindy button. And so just things like that I have super fond memories of Disney in general, not necessarily going to Disney, but just of what the world of Disney creates. And the magic continues into adulthood. It's getting to experience things that just make you feel joy, to step into another world away from your worries and your problems, and to something that just, it's a fandom also that just brings people together. I've made so many friends through social media, through different Disney events, of just people who have a love of this world building and this creating. And it's cool to have seen that expanded as we've gotten older. I have a different appreciation for, like we were talking about, the layout and all of the details that go into the creation of the parks, as well as I have friends who work at Disney that I go to see. So like I know people who are character performers and people who have put together the fireworks show lighting and people who have done the staging. And so it's cool to be able to go and see my friends, whether they work in the parks or not, but also just to experience that magic with people who have never been to Disney or haven't been since they were really young. So recently I went with my parents in May, and my dad hadn't been since our one trip in 2000, which so much has changed since 2000. It's so cool. Like when we walked into Galaxy's Edge, to just see his face when you see this massive Millennium Falcon, like straight out of a movie in real life, just like sitting in front of your eyes. It's cool to experience those things through somebody else's eyes, and the excitement that it brings that you just see through other people. And I think that's such a cool bonding experience between people to do something like that. So for me, that's what it means. It's connection with friends, with family, and to just a simpler time, but also just what that magic looks like now in my life.
Well, that was a beautiful answer.
Yeah.
I'm like feeling inspired to go to Disney myself already. But I often think of planning a trip to Disney, and it can be expensive and overwhelming. And I really liked how you touched upon like base it around like a must do. Like, okay, you're trying to go see all the rides that you can, or you're trying to just go and eat the different foods around the world, like stuff like that. So for someone who maybe has like a tighter budget and is going to Disney for the first time, or is just overwhelmed because there's so much and there's so many Disney blogs and YouTube videos and now podcasts. What are some like must-dos that you would suggest for someone who's trying to plan maybe their first Disney trip, or for someone who hasn't gone in 24 years like your dad?
Figure out your top priorities. So one, figure out how long you're going, because a 2 to 3 day trip is going to look very different than a 7-day trip. Your budget, if you're operating on a lower budget versus a higher budget, that will make distinctions of things like whether you decide to stay on property or not. So some of the on property costs can be a bit higher, whereas some of the other local hotels you might be able to get a cheaper rate, but it does depend on like your time, transportation, that sorts of thing. So I think we're going to touch a bit more on that later, but that is a factor into your budget. If you care about like if you want to ride every ride in those parks, you may want to pay a bit more to get something that's newer called Genie Plus. And that's something where you can basically skip the line and not have to wait in a really long line. And you can have one to three of those reservations at any given time throughout the day. Whereas like my dad was like, I hate crowds. I do not want to stand in line. I will pay the extra 15 to 20 bucks a day. And that flexes depending on how many humans are in the park that day. Sometimes it's cheaper, sometimes it's more expensive, depending on if it's peak spring break and everybody is there, or if it's the middle of January and everyone's chilled out after the holidays and it's not super busy. So those are some things that you would want to balance. And if, for example, you just want to see the entertainment stuff, that all is included in your park ticket. There's nothing like additional you have to do or any lines you have to wait in. You just need to know where you need to be to see those shows, which is very helpful. Are there characters you want to meet? You sort of just have to figure out what your top priorities are, and those are all helpful in planning one, how many days you should be spending in the parks, if it's worth it to get a park hopper. If you're only there for 2 to 3 days, I'd maybe suggest doing park hopper, which is a bit more expensive but will allow you to go to multiple parks in the same day. Whereas if you know, I want to spend a ton of time in Magic Kingdom, my kids are little, and you want to see all the characters, you want them to ride all the kiddie rides, Magic Kingdom is a good full park day, especially if you have kids, versus if you have kids and you're going to Epcot, maybe that's not a full park day for someone with kids, because there are less kids rides there and there's more adult oriented things like drinking around the world or different foods to try, and there are some bigger rides for kids maybe who aren't so small. So those are some things that you can sort of take into consideration when planning. One thing you can also do, there are several Disney like travel planners that are working through Disney but give free services to a certain extent, and you can just Google and do a lot of that finding. I'm sure Disney links them somewhere as well, but I know several people who do that, and that's a great way where if you literally are just so overwhelmed and say you have a big family or you've never been and you just don't know where to start and you don't have any like friends or anyone close to help you think about that, there are those specific services as well that they're basically paid and contracted through Disney to try to help get more people to the parks. So that is a good way for folks who maybe are on a tighter budget or just like hate planning. I love planning, but I have friends and coworkers who hate the planning process. So if you're one of those people, a Disney travel planner is definitely something I'd recommend.
Yeah. Yeah, I see them everywhere.
Yeah.
I see them everywhere. And I'm like, how do I get to be you? And there's a very clear path for how to get to be them. To be clear, I just have never done it. But and this is like, yes, I love the planning also. So you're in good company. So let's officially say that we're moving into a Disney World conversation. Like we're just going to talk about Disney World at this point in the episode. So we've kind of already started to touch on like, okay, Magic Kingdom's a great park for kids. I almost said great park for friends, which is also true. But you said kids, so we're going to go with that. So in your opinion, what are like the best qualities of each of the parks? And like what would be like, say you had one day and you're choosing one park, what would be the pitch for each park?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for Magic Kingdom, like I said, there's a lot of ride variety. So my mom loved Magic Kingdom because she's not great with like big thrill rides. So especially if you have family members who maybe aren't great with coasters or like want to ride rides but like and want to be in those different worlds but don't want something as extreme, Magic Kingdom is your park. So that is a great way to get all of the mix of rides and entertainment as well. Magic Kingdom has fantastic entertainment. So they have several different parades that go on throughout the day, and those involve different character performers that kind of walk through, especially down Main Street. But you can see them kind of in some of the side lands as well. And those are just really fun to see. And especially if you want to see a bunch of characters, but you don't want to wait in line to meet a bunch of them, you can see a lot of them in the parades. There are also castle shows. So, for example, Magic Kingdom typically opens at 9 a.m., sometimes 8:30, for everybody. And they do like a little welcome show, and the Mickey and friends like have this fun little singing to welcome and open the park, and they shoot off a big firework, and that opens the park every day, which is super fun. So that's a cute thing to see. They also have stage shows. I know Elsa does a big like number, and there's fog, and so there's just cool entertainment factors. And then obviously the fireworks at the end of the day. Happily Ever After is my favorite set of fireworks ever. I cry every time I see them. I saw one of the very last shows in 2021 before the show went away for the 50th anniversary. That was my first trip back to Disney post COVID. And my friend and I were like, we have to go before they get rid of Happily Ever After, because we didn't know if they were ever going to bring it back. And I'd only seen it virtually because of COVID. And so we just went. We had a friend who lived down there, and we're like, we're going to go for 3 days. We're going to see Happily Ever After. We're going to cry. It's going to be great. So that I would go to Magic Kingdom just to see Happily Ever After. But it's just the way the music is compiled. I'm a huge fan of like music and musical scores, and the way that specific score for the show is just woven together. It's so seamless, and it pulls from different movies at different points in time that pull nostalgia from different points in your life. So for example, Frozen came out when I was in college, and me and all of my college roommates went to see it. So anytime I hear or see something related to Frozen, I think of them. And so that brings back a moment, like a time point in your life connected to certain people. And so you'll see whenever I do a run event, I always think of Hercules and Go the Distance. So that song always brings back fond memories for me. Just when I hear it, even if I'm running a Disney race or a regular race, it brings me back to like the first race I ever did. And I was training, and my friends were like, you need to put all this great Disney music, especially Go the Distance, in your playlist. And so the show itself just brings back so many different memories of different time points of Disney. And so that is a high pitch for Magic Kingdom, which is
so
fantastic.
good.
Kind of make it whatever you want. For Epcot, Guardians Cosmic Rewind is my favorite ride in all of Epcot. I have gotten all 6 songs now. For listeners who don't know, this is a coaster, and it's called an Omni coaster. And I think it's one of 2 in the United States that basically is on a forward moving track, but your car can move. Like, I don't know if it's 180 or 360 as the cart itself is moving. And so the experience you get on the coaster is just so different than just going forward or backwards. You're like, depending on which car you're in the 10 car track, you'll be flowing and turning differently at any given time. And you can get one of 6 songs on the ride. And so it's just completely random. So for the listeners, you can get September Disco Inferno, Everybody Wants to Rule the World, One Way or Another, Iran, which is also So Far Away in parentheses, or Conga. The first one I got was September, which is still one of my favorites.
So good.
My dad and I got Iran. So it's a good time, but it's one of the things that my dad said is it's one of the smoothest coasters he's ever been on. It's one of the most technologically recent coasters, and every time you go on it, it feels like a new experience. Like the bringing in of the different songs, and just like depending on the car you choose to sit in. I love the front car or the very back car, but for people who aren't great with motion, sitting in the middle is great because you get less pull and umph and turning if you're sitting in the middle. So I had a few friends who aren't great with that, so we sat closer to the middle. So if you still want to give it a shot, maybe just try to sit in rows like 4 through 8. But that's one of my favorite Epcot things. And the amazing festivals. I think we'll get around to the festivals later, but Epcot just has the coolest festivals that really bring just something new foods every year, new performances to the parks. And that's a really big draw for me for Epcot, is when one of those festivals is happening. And then the new Luminous fireworks show. I was a big fan of the previous fireworks show, so I was skeptical going into this new fireworks show, but I saw it for the first time with my college roommates back in January, and we loved it. Like it's very looking for the right word, melody based, and it ties in a lot of different like musical elements from some more nostalgic Disney movies. So for example, one of the songs was the song that one of my college roommates sang for his audition song to get into college. So like watching his face and like start to tear up over, like, because we didn't know, we had never seen it, and just like being in there in that moment, because we met freshman year, and like it was just tied to a lot of happy memories. So it's really cool. And just seeing a lot of the way the lights and the fireworks bring in all of the different countries from around the world is a very cool thing to do. You can go watch it on YouTube as well, and it's very cool to watch. So those are, and then obviously if you're a fan of the adult beverages, then drinking around the world is super fun, especially if there's a festival going on or if there's specialty like food or drink booths. That's always a good time as well. So Epcot, those are my pitches. Hollywood Studios is one of my favorite parks, so I have a little bit of bias towards Hollywood Studios. But that has to do with Galaxy's Edge, like I talked about earlier, is just so immersive. The rides, the characters. You can build a droid, you can build a lightsaber. There are just a lot of cool events that happen in there. And then Toy Story Land itself is just visually so stunning. There are some super cool rides in there too, but just like walking through and seeing again, it's a very detailed park. I think Hollywood Studios is one of the ones I paid the most attention to detail because they have the more newer lands that have been added in. And so you can see the Green Army Men come out and like do some fun drumming. You'll run into Buzz and Woody and Jesse and characters just walking around. And I took my parents for the first time to Woody's Roundup Barbecue, which is one of the most recent restaurants that opened, and that was really good. That was just a fun, again, immersive environment. They gave you little horses to like ride in, like those little kitty horses. They were like, "Do you want to ride the horses into the restaurant?" And I was like, "You betcha." My dad was like, "Nope." But my mom and I were like, "Heck yeah." It's one of those things, and like they'll do different announcements over the intercom of like, Andy's coming, and everyone has to like freeze, like including the servers, all of the patrons. Like it was just it's such a fun environment that you really feel like you've been plopped into these stories. And I think that's one of the coolest things if you want to feel that. And then Fantasmic, of course. Fantasmic recently came back, and for listeners who don't know, this is the big nighttime show that happens in this really big amphitheater with performances from different characters from different times in Disney's history, but it's based around originally the Fantasmic era of Mickey, and you get to see fire-breathing dragons and like cool boats with all the characters on it. I have a friend who's a character performer right now in the show, so it's always cool to get to go.
Oh my god, that's so fun.
And see and be like, I'll text her like, "Are you in the show tonight?" Sort of. Those are all really, really cool things. And then going to Oga's Cantina in Galaxy's Edge after hours is something that I would pitch for that park as well, because the park closes at 9, technically, most nights. But you can get an Oga's reservation anywhere from 9 to 10 p.m. And then when you leave, there's like no one in the park. So it's just cool to be there when nobody else is there. And it can be hard to snag those reservations, but if you look early enough, either the 60-day out reservation window for restaurants or like the night before, a lot of people start like dropping if they're tired or their plans change. So like if you can't get into certain restaurants, but especially Oga's Cantina, a lot of the times you can get a reservation the day before, which is very cool. And then Animal Kingdom's the last park. So Animal Kingdom is great for kids. I would never pitch it as a full day park unless like some special event is happening, but there are some very cool rides. The safari is always a 10 out of 10 because that's a different experience. It's typically a 25-minute ride, so it's a lot longer than your typical ride, and you never know what animals are going to be out, what they're going to be doing, how they're going to be interacting. Some of the best safaris I've been on is in the pouring rain. The animals love to just wander. My mom and I were on it in the pouring rain. There were so many animals out. And one time my brother and I were on, and we pulled up right next to a giraffe who was just munching on this massive tree, and we all stopped, and he turned to us and looked straight at us and was just like munching a bunch of leaves. I have the funniest video. It's like they're
That's
like
incredible.
not even bothered by people, but it's just kind of like, "Hey, what's up? I'm eating my breakfast or I'm eating my lunch." So that's always a super cool thing. So everything from kids to adults, that's a super cool thing to do. And just wander. And then I have always loved Everest. I love coasters, and so Everest is one of the like bigger rides you can do. When we first went years and years ago, we made our friends ride it like back to back to back because there was no line, and there's a single rider line. So if the line is really backed up, you can get in the single rider line and get on in like a third of the time, which is fantastic. So those are all of the main things I would pitch. All of the parks are great for different reasons. It just sort of depends what your priorities are and like what you're most interested in. What I would recommend doing.
Wow. That was a plethora of information.
Yeah, the thing is that I think Disney has something for literally everybody. And your pitches just kind of proved that, I would say. So let's say you've decided what parks you want to go to, like you know how you're getting to Disney, like you figured out everything. Now, what are are there hotels that you would recommend or that are your favorites? Are there restaurants that are your favorites or that you would recommend? What is transportation like? Like, what is it like, all of those different aspects outside of the parks?
Yeah, so I'll start with accommodations like hotels and transportation, then we'll go into food because I have lots of food thoughts.
Yes.
So let's talk about on property versus off property. So there are benefits, cons, pros to both. So if you're on property, which means you're staying on a Disney affiliated property, the cost can be a little bit higher, but there are different segments or like tiers per se of hotels. So you can still get like a cheaper end, cheap is relative, but lower end cost hotel and still like not be paying an arm and a leg. So some perks of being on property are it's great for breaks. So if you're someone who, especially if you're going when it's really hot, I tell everyone, please take a break, whether that's like making a restaurant reservation and being inside in the AC and being off your feet, or taking a break in the middle of the day. It's great because if you're staying on property, there's Disney transportation. So they have buses from all of the resorts to all of the parks. Or if you're staying at specific resorts, you also have the Skyliner as an option. And I'll dig into that in a little bit. So that is one of the biggest perks is when you underestimate how tired you're going to be at the end of the day, and it depends on the heat level. So my how tired I was from January versus my May trip are very different because of the heat, and you forget, especially if you're not from a humid area or you don't live in Florida, you underestimate how draining the heat is, and just being on your feet the whole day is super draining. So being on property is great for that bus or Skyliner transportation. And then there's also food on site. So if you're staying at any of the Disney hotels, the food is not included, but it is there. It is very easy to just walk to the main building, grab some food, go back to your hotel room. You can also order room service if you want to. So there's just very easy access, as well as all of the pools and another way to relax where everything's sort of in one place, which is really nice. If you decide you don't have the money or don't want to stay on property, staying off property tends to be a bit cheaper. So there are a few options when you're staying off property. There are some still Disney affiliated hotels that are out by Disney Springs, for example, like the Hilton or the Wyndham, that are still, you'll still get early entry to the parks, or you'll still have the shuttle or a bus to be able to take you to the parks, but you're not paying necessarily as high of a price as you would on Disney property. And at least I know at the Hilton you can get an annual pass discount because I have used that. I don't remember at the Wyndham, but some of the other hotels that are still technically Disney affiliated do offer annual pass discounts. If you're staying like off property, occasionally they'll have shuttles, but a lot of the times they won't, and you have to figure out your own transportation. So is it something where, did you fly in and get a rental car? Because you're going to have to think about parking costs. If you're an annual pass holder, you get free parking. So that is a that is a plus, but it's still,
and parking is $30, so that's a good deal.
per day so yeah, it's a bit costly. So staying on property, you will avoid those specific fees, or if you're at a Disney affiliated hotel. If you're off property, you either have to, I have Ubered once, which can get a bit costly, or you have to drive. I've had friends who have brought cars, and we've gone on property to the parks that way. So if you're off property, you do have to think about the transportation a bit more, and are those costs going to offset the cost you would pay to be staying on property? That's something you have to consider. Or do you need a room for like 15 people, whereas like you might book a local Airbnb if you're having like a big group of people versus trying to get 4 different rooms on property? That could be a bit more costly. So it depends on your budget, the size of the human group you are bringing, and how you want to sort of balance those pros and cons. The Skyliner is a fantastic transportation option. It is my favorite modality of transportation on Disney property. And sort of going off of that, my favorite Disney hotel is Pop Century because of that. So I haven't been able to stay at like, we stayed at when I was young, when we went once when I was young, we stayed at the Polynesian before their prices were like really high. I could not afford now to stay at the Polynesian. But Pop Century is the higher end of the lowest tier of cost, if that makes sense. So it's still a super nice hotel. It has the Skyliner for transportation as well as buses. So you can Skyliner from Pop Century to Hollywood Studios as well as Epcot, which is fantastic. And so that is a super big plus. You're not sitting, they're basically, if no one who knows what the Skyliner is, it's basically this gondola system of cars that Disney has created, that you hop in the little gondola and it takes you from one place to another. And there are different transfer points depending on if you're going to Hollywood Studios or to Epcot. A few of the other resorts that are also on the Skyliner are the Riviera, Disney's Caribbean Resort, which I really liked as well. I stayed there when I ran a race, and that they've redone that since I stayed there, but that's a super nice area as well, and it's also right off the Skyliner. And the opposite of Pop Century is Art of Animation, which is also a super cool resort to just walk around because it's got a lot of old Disney animation of different styles. So it's got like Cars and Ariel and just different segments of like original, really cool animated Disney things. And that one also tends to be really popular, but tends to be a bit more costly than Pop Century, which Pop Century is more decade based. So it's got different segments of 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and the pools and the rooms are all themed around those decades. So it's always like, oh, which decade am I going to get? It's a fun, for those of us, especially who grew up in the 90s, it's like, oh, look at all the
Yep.
the 90s.
The Walkman. Yep.
And it's all the way in the back, so you got to do a little bit of walking, but you're like, oh, that's okay. But that's my favorite because it's still not as super costly, and you have both the bus and the Skyliner transportation options, which I think is a good balance for like your money also staying on Disney property. So that tends to be my go-to if I'm staying on property. When I go next week, I'm actually staying at All Star Music, I think. So that'll be the first time I'm staying there, but I've heard that that's a really fun one too. And that is also a lower end budget option for Disney. So that should be super cool. So those are all transportation related things. Getting to and from the airport is also something to think about. A lot of the time I've just Ubered, which is like, it's depending on where you're staying, it's like a 25-minute Uber. And if you're coming at rush hour, it can be a little bit of a costly Uber. The other option is Mears Connect, which is like Disney's bus transportation system. And that drops people off at various Disney resort properties. And the cost tends to be maybe slightly less than an Uber, but you're compensating your time for getting to your resort more directly taking an Uber. Or you rent a car and you have to pick up the car and you drive the car. Or you have a friend pick you up. I've done everything except Mears Connect. I used to ride whatever the original like free Disney shuttle used to be before the pandemic. At least back in 2017, they used to have a free shuttle, and then they made the Mears Connect system. So I used to use the shuttle, and that was great. So I can't speak for Mears Connect, but I know several people do that, and it's great, especially if you have like a big group of people, or if you're connecting between Disney World and going on a Disney cruise going out of Port Canaveral. There's like a shuttle bus that does that as well. So when thinking about that, the transportation is also something to think about. It's great if you can split an Uber with friends, family, if you all fly in together or can like organize your travel to land at the same time. I try to do that if my friends and I are flying all from different places, because that lowers your cost a lot, because you're like, okay, I can fit 3, maybe 4 people, or even just splitting between 2 is a lot less costly than paying for it by yourself.
That's a great point. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are great transportation things.
Well, that's where we're going to wrap up for our part 1 of our 2-part series on Walt Disney World. Rachel, thank you so much for coming on and chatting through all of this with us and our guests today. And everybody, tune in a couple of weeks for part 2, where we talk about food. Oh my goodness, you won't want to miss it. Special events in Disney World, and so much more. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to the Wanderlusting Lives podcast. Come escape with us again every other Tuesday for Travel Tuesdays.
Don't forget to give us a subscribe and a follow on all of our social media and wherever you listen to your podcasts. And until next time, wander on!